Okay, pretty quick and easy lecture today. We're going to do the second declension neuters, and then we're going to talk about the three kinds of adjectives. So, what's a declension? A declension is a group of spellings, which means that if you learn something a noun belongs to one declension or another, you don't learn anything about its meaning. All nouns belong to a declension. We're going to learn today some nouns that belong to the second declension neuter. Now we call this second declension just like the second declension masculine, which is currently on the screen, because they're spelled very, very similarly, right? They're part of a similar group of spellings. So here's the second declension masculine singular, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. Here is the second declension neuter singular. The genitive, identical, e. Dative, o, so doni, dono. The accusative is identical, donum, and the ablative is identical. So these are very similar, right? In fact, so far they're identical, which is why we call them both second declension. But the nominative singular of the second declension neuter is One thing you'll find is that the nominative and accusative of neuter nouns, of all declensions, are identical. So, how do we tell the difference between donum, the accusative, and donum, the nominative? Context. The nominative singular and the accusative singular are indistinguishable on form. We have to use context. We're going to find a similar set of patterns in the plurals. So, let's remind ourselves what the second declension masculine plurals are. So, second declension masculine, the plurals you've already learned, are amici, amicorum, amicis, amicos, amicis. So, something you're very familiar with. These are the second declension masculine plurals. The neuters, likewise, are going to be very similar. Amicorum is identical. Donorum, the neuter, donum, is identical. Donis, identical. Donis, identical. The nominative and accusative plural are unique, however. Dona, dona, just an A. It looks kind of like the feminine first declension, right? Or it just kind of looks like the first declension. These are the nominative and accusative plurals. You actually know a word. In fact, you know several words that follow this pattern. A datum is a singular piece of given information. A datum. The plural of datum is data. An agendum, not a word we use very often. An agendum would be the Latin. An agendum would be a singular thing which needs to be done. But the plural would be agenda, things to be done, a word you're very familiar with. And there are many more of these. Is the singular, is the plural. If you can think of any words that have a plural ending just in a, it probably means they're from a second declension neuter Latin noun. How do you know a word is second declension neuter? Well, when you are given the dictionary entry, you are given it with the nominative and the accusative, right? So we get don, don, So very distinctive, right? You got your and your Your nominative, you're given the genitives. Don, don, e. There we go. Sorry about that. You're given the nominative singular and the genitive singular, just like always. So this tells you it's this M here in the second declension nominative singular tells you this is a nominative, so it tells you this must be a neuter noun. Okay, there are three kinds of adjectives. They are attributive, which we'll talk about first, predicate, and substantive. So the attributive adjectives are the kind you're most familiar with. It's the kind we've already talked about. The attributive adjectives are when a noun is paired up with an adjective and it's usually assumed information. So the frightened student, or the scary teacher, or the pretty books, right? That could be in your subject, that could be in your predicate, it could be in a relative clause, it could be anywhere, right? The frightened teacher was worried about the scary students, right? Attributive adjectives, both. Very normal, and as we've already talked about, they have to match in case, gender, and number. Okay? Second kind, predicate adjectives. And these are going to be adjectives that we predicate to something, usually a noun, but something. The teacher is scary, right? We are saying about the teacher that he is scary. That's a predicate adjective. And these are going to match their nouns, usually in number, and they're usually going to be the same case because it's going to be nominative. Something is something. So they're usually going to match in case. That's the predicate nominative we talked about in our first lecture. If you're going to say something is something, you're going to put both in the nominative because we're drawing an equation between them. They won't always match in gender, right? Because if you're going to say somebody is something, if that's they'll usually match in gender. Because usually we can, there are exceptions, there are situations where they don't. Can use, as we'll see, substantive adjectives, and they'll usually match in gender, but there are places and times where they don't need to, which is also true in English. If you're going to predicate something of something else, sometimes you're going to use a different gender. Then we have our substantive adjectives. These are sometimes tricky for students at first, but we do this in English too. What kind of car do you like? The blue or the red? So blue and red are adjectives, not nouns. But blue, the blue, stands in for the blue car. But I don't have to say car again. I can just say the blue. It rains on the wicked and the just alike. Wicked and just what? Well, it's so obvious in the first case that I mean car, and in the second case that I mean people, that I don't actually have to say wicked people and just people alike. I can leave that implied. That's what a substantive adjective does. There will be times where the noun that's implied is so obvious, like the wicked and the just, that you don't have to include the noun. And so the substantive is going to be standing in for the noun, or it's going to have an implied noun that maybe you'll supply. If you could say the wicked and the just car, or just people. But sometimes it'll be more appropriate stylistically to just leave it substantive in English, because we can do substantive adjectives just like Latin does. They're going to take the case, the gender, and the number of their implied nouns. So you'll see this sometimes is helpful. And you can do something like just use the word for, you can use an adjective and make it feminine, plural, and then we're talking about a group of feminine, plural people. Probably, unless there's another obvious feminine noun referent. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to get rid of these. So there are three kinds of adjectives. There are the attributive, predicate, substantive. And they all match with a noun, but sometimes the noun is right next to it, like with attributive. Sometimes the noun is in the subject, and we are predicating an adjective to that noun. We're saying the thing we're asserting about that noun is that it is this adjective. And sometimes the noun is so obvious that they leave it implied, the substantive adjectives. Look at the examples of the three kinds of adjectives in the textbook. They list several in Latin with their translation. Super helpful.